Good evening, everybody. I'm Dr. Sampath Chandra Prasad Rao. I'm a skull-based surgeon based out of Bangalore. It is such a pleasure, honor, and a privilege for me here to be with all of you today at this prestigious meeting in Egypt, organized by Professor Aziz Bilal, whom I know very well and with whom I'm in constant touch and on social media, and I appreciate his enthusiasm and all that he does for the promotion of the subspecialty of otology, ENT, and skull-based surgery. So thank you, Professor Bilal, for giving me this opportunity and for giving me this platform to address all of you. So the mandate that I have today is to talk on lateral skull-based surgery, the present and the future. And I would like to begin my presentation by expressing my gratitude to my master and mentor in lateral skull-based surgery, Professor Mario Sanna, with whom I was for close to 6.5 years learning the nuances of skull-based surgery, and the impression he's left on me has been tremendous. So I begin by showing this video in most of my presentations, and you'll soon know why.
Don't tell me you don't know how to do that. How did you get by the laser field in the Great Hall? Aha, the laser fields. Well.
So if you look at what's happening here, and this is from Ocean's 11, one of my favorite movies. So the thief plans to steal the piece of jewelry that is in a museum, going through these laser beams, which obviously would set off an alarm if they're encountered. So. So this is akin to skull-based surgery, I would say. Skull-based surgery is going through an anatomy that is filled with structures that resemble the laser beams. There are arteries, nerves, vessels, and osseous structures that need to be respected and preserved during surgery for us to be able to give optimal results. And like in this case, we have a situation like this where there is an anatomy like this. This is the anatomy of the cerebellopontine angle. It's a ventral view of the cerebellopontine angle where you can see the trigeminal nerve and superiorly the scar along with the trigeminal nerve, the flocculus of the cerebellum, the acousticofascial bundle with the ICA loop, the lower cranial nerves, the 9th, 10th, 11th, and the 12th cranial nerves in the lower part of the cerebellopontine angle, around which is what we call the pica posterior inferior cerebellar artery. The basilar artery can be seen here, and along with this, you can see the cerebellum, the pons, and the medulla, all important structures which need to be uh, deliberated upon during skull-based surgery. Another view of the cerebellopontine angle after retraction of the cerebellum, showing similar structures. The additional structure that you see here, the blue vein is the Dandy's vein, and this is a lateral view of the CP angle, and you see how complicated the anatomy is, and one has to respect each and every of these structures to be able to remove a tumor safely without complications. This is a view, a lateral view, a posterolateral view, where a partial petrosectomy has been done. The facial nerve can be seen here laterally going into the internal meatus. From there on, the nerve has been cut to show you the deeper portions of the CP angle. This is the chorda tympani, the middle ear, the labyrinthine block can be seen here. The entire jugulosigmoid complex can be seen after removal of the posterior petrous bone. The inferior petrosal sinus can be seen, and the lower cranial nerves here, the 9th, 10th, the 11th cranial nerve and the 12th cranial nerve can all be seen getting into the neural compartment of the jugular bulb. The ICA loop can be seen. The pica loop is lower down, and deep inside you can see the 6th cranial nerves and the basilar artery. Now, the infratemporal fossa is the third compartment. I always divide skull base into the intracranial compartment, temporal compartment, and the infratemporal compartment. So the intracranial anatomy is what I showed you. Now I'm showing you the infratemporal fossa anatomy. The roof of the infratemporal fossa is formed by the temporal bone itself, with the petrous portions, the mastoid portions, and the most important tympanic bone, a small bone but very crucial bone which needs to be drilled out to be for us to be able to access the deeper petrous areas. Now the petrous portion of the temporal bone amalgamates or fuses with the occipital bone posteriorly and the greater wing of sphenoid anteriorly. So you see, this whole area is filled with structures, and one needs to understand that anatomy in this area can be quite complicated. So this is a superior view of the infratemporal fossa. For those of you uninitiated with anatomy, you need to understand that we're looking at this from above. This is the petrous bone, and this is the Meckel's cave area. A part of the petrous bone has been drilled out. The infratemporal fossa musculature has been resected out. So let's begin with the carotid here. You can see the cavernous carotid, the paraclavial carotid is here, the petrous carotid is here. V1, V2, V3 branches of the trigeminal nerve, and you can clearly see that they go into the respective territories. I'm not here to describe the anatomy because this is a 20-minute lecture which I'm supposed to give an overview of what's happening in skull base today, and and what's in store with us in the future. So briefly, this is the nasal cavity, the septum, and this is the orbit here. The optic nerve can be seen getting into the intracranial cavities, and this is how the skull base looks from above. Now this is another view, the right infratemporal fossa with the musculature and the nerves and the vessels, all inclusive. So again, the eyeball and the optic nerve, the branches of the trigeminal nerve with the Meckel's cave intact here. The brain is obviously not there. The cavernous carotid, the paraclavial carotid, lateral carotid can be seen. The facial nerve can be seen laterally in this picture. In the far right hand corner, with its branches, the chorda tympani, and its path in the internal artery meatus. The temporomandibular joint is what you see here, and superiorly you see the pterygoid muscles and the zygoma, which forms the boundary of the infratemporal fossa. Now, what are the approaches to the skull base? The approaches to the skull base can be broadly divided into superior approaches, which are the FTOZ approaches, the frontotemporoorbiter zygomatic approaches, and the middle fossa approaches, the transtemporal approaches, which mean the translabyrinthine, transaortic, and the transcochlear approaches, and more posterior or rather neurosurgical approaches like the retrosigmoid and the suboccipital approach. Now, for us to understand where we are today and what the future could be, we need to step back and look into the past, because from the past we get the inspiration to move forward, and we clearly can see that from the 1700s onwards we have come a long way. If you look at this particular picture, this is how surgery was done in the past. If you look at the diagrams from, I think this is Walter Dandy's textbook. You can, oh no, it's Harvey Cushing's textbook on acoustic neuroma. You can clearly see that there is a incision marked out for a suboccipital approach. It was a fairly large incision exposing the entire posterior cranial fossa. The cerebellum had to be retracted, sometimes even resected. Here you can see the cerebellum was in fact resected to be able to approach some of these tumors, and a shunt had to be done to remove CSF from the lateral ventricle to enable relaxation of the brain. So this was in the early 1900s, and leading the charge into the skull base was were these two giants of neurosurgery, that is Harvey Cushing and Walter Dandy. Now Harvey Cushing was a master, Walter Dandy was a student, but Walter Dandy went on to become a legend unto himself. And somewhere along the way, the master student duo fell apart and had a conflict of, I would say, academic philosophies, surgical philosophies. While Harvey Cushing, who can be credited with the invention of the surgical gloves, monopolar, bipolar, and a million other things, and he was a doyen and a giant by right. He, through his career, learned and realized that total tumor resections of vestibuloschwannoma left with a lot of mortality, morbidity, and hence he began leaving some tumor behind, what we today call subtotal resection or near total resections. And these resections in his hands gave favorable results because they preserved lower cranial nerves, facial nerve, but in the long run, there was a recurrence, a second surgery, and that led to more difficult circumstances. So Walter Dandy, what he did was, what he emphasized was on total tumor resections right in the first go. And he said that the facial nerve paralysis and perhaps even low cranial nerve paralysis were a small price to pay in the course of tumor treatment. In the 60s or 70s and 80s, lateral skull base surgery saw a drastic change due to the fact that autologists, neuro-autologists, bravely ventured into the unknown, I would say, in the temporal territory and the inferotemporal territory. And leading the charge was William House and Hugo Fish and their student Mario Sanna, with whom from whom I have learned my skull base surgery. These were the doyens of neuroautology. And in the Bill House era, it was an age of microsurgery, because Bill House brought in the microscope and the drill, both two very essential tools into autology and thereby lateral skull base surgery. Hugo Fish mapped up the entire infratemporal fossa, and his infratemporal fossa approaches are what we follow today. Mario Sanna brought in everything together, and his was an age of consolidation and rationalization of several approaches. So the winds of change brought in the transtemporal and infratemporal approaches. And using these approaches, the cerebellopontine angle lesions were also looked upon in a new way. Now, while we with the neurosurgical approaches were always retrosigmoid and suboccipital approaches, the transtemporal approaches gave a whole new dimension, because here was an approach that did not involve cerebellar retraction, and due to which morbidity and mortality is reduced drastically from close to I'll skip this slide, from close to 40% during Bill House's time to about 1% with the translabyrinthine approach, with the transtemporal approaches. So morbidity and mortality reduced with the transtemporal approaches, because it did not involve brain retraction, and facial nerve reconstruction too was possible, because both the ends of the facial nerve are now available with the transtemporal approaches. Not only that, today the transtemporal approaches have also made possible amalgamation of implantology. Cochlear implants, auditory brain stem implants can be done safely and easily with the transtemporal approaches. The genius of Bill House needs to be compared with the genius of Harvey Cushing. Bill House rediscovered the translabyrinthine approach, which was an approach that was described by Franciscus Hubertus Quix way back in 1911. But at that time, Quix used a chisel and a hammer to achieve a subtotal resection. But for some reason, this was not taken kindly by the doyens during those days, Cushing and Dandy, and they came down hard on this approach, and this was relegated into the dustbins of history for several decades before Bill House reintroduced the translabyrinthine approach in the early 60s. He also reintroduced the middle cranial fossa approach for vestibular schwannomas. He was architect of the cochlear implant, auditory brain stem implant, which has given hearing to millions of people who could not have been rehabilitated with optimal hearing without this technology. Now, the genius of Bill House was also his relationship, with the way he dealt with his relationships with his peers, with his neurosurgical team. So with Bill Hitzelberger, William Hitzelberger, he formed a unbeatable team, which went on to remove close to 6,000 tumors, and they both set up what is called the House Ear Institute, and it's one of the world's premier centers of the Mecca for skull base surgery today. And both House and Hitzelberger kept a steady, grounded relationship and a deep relationship for several decades, and their contribution has been immense to the field of skull base surgery. So what are the challenges of skull base surgery? Skull base surgery, lateral skull base, involves a complex anatomy, as I told you earlier. The rarity of cases makes learning difficult too. These tumors don't come often. Unless you're a reputed center, these tumors do not come to you on a routine basis. The learning curve is long. As in my case, I spent a good 6.5, 7 years learning from Mario Sanna and several other masters from Europe. And it was not an easy task to be away from my country, my home, from my family, to be able to learn what I had to learn. So training also has to be done under the eyes of the masters. There is no self-learning in lateral skull base surgery. The but today we have seen a paradigm shift in lateral skull base surgery. So a comprehensive mapping of the lateral skull base, rational and safe approaches through the skull base, effective neuroradiological solutions, neuronavigation, neuromonitoring have all made skull base surgery a doable thing, and no tumor today is considered inoperable. So if you look at this picture on the right, this is of a patient with an F2 bilateral vestibular schwannoma. This patient was referred to me from Dubai, and I did this case 2 months back. Now, if you look at the size of the tumor, it can look scary to the uninitiated, but then with all the tools that we have, with the experience that one gains with going through skull base training, all these tumors can be resected in its entirety. So from a bits and pieces approach, skull base surgery today is now a well-researched subspecialties incorporating neurosurgical principles, neurotological principles, head and neck surgery, and more importantly, and also principles of implantology. And all this together is the real skull base surgery. If there is a team doing only a part of this, and if there is no consolidated multicentric approach to skull base surgery, results will surely not be as they should be. In Bangalore, we do a very unique course, and one of the most sought after courses in this part of the world, called World Skull Base Fellowship Diploma in both lateral and anterior skull base surgery. So we have laid down a curriculum-based training program which is affiliated to a university, a very important university called Rama University here in Bangalore. We lay the whole curriculum, and we train the participants both in dissections as well as theory, and by some of the masters of skull base surgery today. Now, what are the radiological tools? We'll begin with radiology and how there is a progressive development technology as far as radiology is concerned. Now, radiologically, apart from the routine CT and MR, we need to know that a CT angio, MR angio, a 4-vessel angio, and balloon occlusion test is what, or balloon occlusion and balloon occlusion test, is what forms the fundamental or the rock bed for diagnosis of all skull base tumors. So, so these are the 4 important tools that one must know all about, or one must be in close association with a very strong radiology team to be able to even diagnose a skull base tumor. So an MR angiography is what we call a time of flight sequence. So in this video here, you see vessels coming out from the aorta, and you see bifurcations here into the carotid vasculature and into the vertebral artery vasculature. There are 4 vessels, but as you go above, you see that one of the vessels completely disappears. Here you can see the carotid bifurcation, but when you go into the cranial cavity, the petrous areas, you can clearly see that one of the carotids is absent, and this is because we have done a balloon occlusion for this case. This is one of my cases, rhabdomyosarcoma of the temporal bone, where I could do a balloon occlusion to achieve radicality and tumor clearance. So in this case, we have done a balloon occlusion. Now, a PET scan is coming into foray more often than not in diagnosis of skull base surgery. I use a PET scan to diagnose some of those paragangliomas that are not so radiologically evident. Paragangliomas are pretty easy to diagnose, but there are some of them that can be quite solid. And differentiating between a paraganglioma that is tympanojugular or a vagal paraganglioma can be quite difficult. And in such cases, a PET scan is very important. An 18F-DOPA scan is what I recommend for all paragangliomas, and they show up nicely in the scans. Now, for instance, if you look at this F18 DOPA scan that was done in a lady with a vagal paraganglioma, you can see that. You can see a very nice lesion coming up in the skull base, and this is most definitely a paraganglioma. You can see here a big tumor in the skull base. This turned out to be a vagal paraganglioma. Similarly, We did a whole body scan to rule out any. So this is the paraganglioma, is the lesion, and we did a whole body scan to rule out any associated lesions. Now this is another case where we did a normal routine PET scan, and this is what it showed: a huge paraganglioma in the skull base. This turned out to be a tympanojugular paraganglioma, and this was both intradural. Now you see this is a massive, massive paraganglioma going intradural, extradural, and obviously destroying the whole of the temporal fossa. Now, having said, the next most important tool radiologically is what we call the 4-vessel angiography. Again, a 4-vessel angiography is done to see the vascularity of a tumor. Here you can see a nice tumor blush coming up between the arterial and venous faces of a 4-vessel angiography. So an angiography is also important because in the same sitting one can do a embolization of a very vascular tumor. Here you can see the ascending pharyngeal artery supplying a tympanojugular paraganglioma. Nice microembolization is done, and after embolization you can see that the tumor blush has completely disappeared and there is no tumor, and this allows a safe bloodless surgery. Okay, now this is again balloon occlusion test. To go again a little into the depth of balloon occlusion test, one needs to know that an occlusion is considered safely possible if the delay between the arterial and venous, I showed you a picture earlier, there's an arterial phase and the venous phase, if the delay between the arterial and venous phase is less than 2 seconds, which means that when one is considering a balloon occlusion, one needs to do a 4-vessel angiography, see how the collateral circulation develops, and if the collateral circulation fills in the ipsilateral circulation, the defect in the ipsilateral circulation due to the balloon occlusion on the ipsilateral side, if the blood comes from the opposite side pretty quickly, and if the difference is less than 2 seconds, then you can do a balloon occlusion. Balloon occlusion can be done electively, preoperatively, or you can do it intraoperatively in case you have to do it to resect achieve a total tumor resection. But what if there is no good contralateral blood supply? What do you do in such a case? At the group otologicom, one of the techniques developed is stenting of the petrous carotid to deal with all lateral skull-based tumors. So we no longer, if the tumor is involving the carotid 270 more than 270 degrees, we do not do a balloon occlusion. We do what is called a stenting of the carotid. So this is a balloon occlusion test. I'll show you how a test is done. This is a balloon occlusion test done for one of my patients. You can see that femoral catheter has been passed, and the dye is injected into both the circulations, and a 4-vessel angiography is done, and a balloon is passed into the catheter, and the ipsilateral carotid is being occluded in this case to see if the patient tolerates a balloon occlusion. So what is done in the interim? Patient is kept awake, and EEG monitoring and a motor function monitoring is done in this case, as you can see here.
Vishwas Jesse, right? Can you show me your tongue? Okay, say E, show me your teeth. Okay. Lift your left hand up. Make a fist.
So you can see that this patient is fully conscious and his motor activity is normal. Similarly, a EEG is done. An EEG is done, and an EEG is monitored for 30 minutes and with hypotension.
Okay. Lift your left.
So if the patient tolerates balloon occlusion, that means that the balloon occlusion can be done. But before this, what can be done is stenting of the carotid if the patient can afford a stenting, because in the developed countries, that's not a problem. In the developing world, stenting itself pretty expensive procedure. So stenting involves placing a stent, as seen here in one of my patients, in the petrous carotid. So you place a stent in the petrous carotid. This is a stent in the petrous carotid. This allows a very, very effective resection, because once the stent is placed and a tunica neointima is developed, the stent allows complete resection of the tumor. So I'm not going into the depth of this. Again, here you see that in this particular case, the petrous carotid is stented. This is very clearly, you can see that the stent is placed here. This was done in one of my cases too. And here in the paraclival areas, you can see the stent very clearly. And this was done to resect a tympanojugular paraganglioma. Now, I'll quickly go through some of the other slides. Now, one of the things that is coming up in a big way in the therapy for lateral skull base is wait and scan. Now, one needs to understand that a lot of these tumors grow slowly. And with the radiological tools that we have today, diagnosis happens pretty early. So smaller tumors are encountered very often. Now, when you have a small tumor, do not rush to go ahead and operate it, because we have seen that tumors like paragangliomas grow very slow. And this was a study done at the Grupo Otologica, and here you can see that when we did a follow-up of about 45 tumors at the Grupo Otologica, and this was a paper published by me along with the group, we found that tumor was stable in 92% of the tumors for close to 3 years, and tumor was stable in 83% up to 5 years, and the tumor was stable even after 5 years in about 45% of the tumors, which means that it's not always necessary to rush into surgery. And this is one of the most important things that we have learned along the way. But what about radiotherapy? Radiotherapy is being spoken about in a big way. Is radiotherapy really effective in head and neck paragangliomas? Now, I've written a paper, I've done a study of top 15 articles a few years back of stereotactic radiotherapy and various other forms of radiotherapy for paragangliomas. And there's another paper on vestibular schwannomas as well. So these are the two most common tumors of the skull base. And when I did research, I found a lot of I would say deficiencies in some of the studies, and what I found was that there was a lack of standardization when it came to what was defined as local control, because most studies said there was a good local control. But what is local control? Whether it is shrinkage, whether it is a frozen tumor, is not really defined in all cases. There is a lack of consensus on indications and contraindications among the radiotherapists themselves. So contraindications for radiotherapy as defined by the radiotherapists in these articles are large tumors, tumors invading the bone, extension below the skull base and neck, encasement of the vessels, but these are the very characteristics of head and neck paragangliomas. So when you say that you cannot use radiotherapy for large tumors involving the bone, extension to the skull base, neck, then what are you using it for? Are you using it for small tumors? Small tumors can be weighted and scanned, and small tumors have very good surgical results, outcomes. So I'm not very sure what we are looking at here. Again, radiotherapists do not follow protocols of a wait and scan to see if the tumor is actually growing, because as I showed you, many tumors do not grow very fast, and we don't know whether what is called control is due to the natural history of the tumor or whether it's due to radiotherapy. So there are several issues. I don't want to go into the details of this, so which is all in this paper. So is radiotherapy really one of the mainstays of treatment? According to me, no. There's a lot of digging in that has to be done for us to really talk about radiotherapy being a optional treatment to surgery for some of these tumors. And one of the molecular biological studies that I did along with Mario's team was indicated that some of them head and neck paragangliomas that are being irradiated, these tumors may be radioresistant themselves because they express what is called the Notch1 receptor gene and ZEB1 transcription factor, and these two factors are render the tumor radioresistant. So we are probably looking at a radioresistant tumor which do not require radiotherapy. Now I'm going to quickly show you one of my cases. So this is a massive paraganglioma. You see huge tympanojugular paraganglioma going intracranial, extracranial, infratemporal, which and this was the patient who had a preoperative facial paralysis for 1 year. So you see that the patient has a preoperative facial paralysis and lower cranial paralysis. He has a hoarseness of voice.
Okay, say ah loudly, loudly. Put your tongue out.
Hypoglossal paralysis.
Right. Okay.
Vagal paralysis.
Both the shoulders.
Multiple cranial paralysis. So what I did was a infratemporal fossa approach, flaps elevated in the periosteal plane. The tumor has been resected. I found the facial nerve, but the facial nerve was practically butchered, I would say, by the tumor involvement. So I decided to sever the nerve. The patient, remember, had a 1 year preoperative facial paralysis. I cut the nerve. I removed the tumor. Here you can see the cochlea. The entire tumor has been removed now. This is the carotid. This is the stented carotid. The intradural part of the tumor was left behind. And following this, I did a sural nerve grafting. And this patient This is the post-op scan of this patient. You can see the stent clearly in the petrous carotid, and this is a post-op MRI which showed all this extradural tumor removed. Now only the intradural part was remaining. Now his facial nerve function came back to HB grade 3. I'm talking about a stented nerve, that this patient has not undergone a lid implant. It is natural facial nerve recovery. The grafted nerve is taken up, and now the patient has a HB grade 3, if you see here. Now his vocal cords have compensated, his voice came back to normal, his hypoglossal muscle function came back to normal, his glossopharyngeal function came back to normal. This is a FEAST study, fiber optic endoscopic evaluation of swallowing study done in my center, which shows that swallowing was absolutely normal and there was practically no pooling of saliva, and this meant that all his lower cranial nerves were compensated. Now I went in for a second surgery to remove the intradural part. Now you see this is the same cavity, the same labyrinthine block preserved, the whole intradural component is now seen. I went inside, I drilled out the labyrinthine block. I had to save the facial nerve. This is the internal artery meatus part of the facial nerve. This is all intradural tumor resection. This is the internal artery meatus part of the facial nerve. All this was resected out. You see, big resection done here. Intradural, that's the brainstem that you see. The whole tumor is gradually being reduced and resected out, and that is the facial nerve preserved. The whole root entry zone of the facial nerve can be seen. The last bit of tumor, that's the ICA loop. The last bit of tumor is being removed from its dural attachment, and this is the final total tumor resection. You can actually see the facial nerve very nicely here. This is the facial nerve going into the brainstem, and there's absolutely no tumor. Total tumor clearance has been achieved. Closed by fat. Again, post-operatively, his facial nerve was intact. Grade 3 was maintained, and this is the scan after total tumor resection, both intradurally and extradurally. There's a small petrous component which I plan to irradiate and close the case. Now, I want to show you another case which I did the infratemporal fossa approach. Now, this was just a rerouting. I want to show you the rerouting recovery. This is facial nerve recovery after rerouting, HB grade 3 in 3 months, and this is practically normal HB grade 1 in 6 months' time. So a lot of people say rerouting, may lead to facial nerve paralysis, but if it's done properly in good hands, you can get a practically a normal facial nerve function in about 6 months' time. Now, I will skip some of these slides to show you, because I'm sure I'm over time now. I wanted to show you a translabyrinthine approach. Okay, I'll just quickly go through some of these slides. A post-oral incision again. This is a translabyrinthine approach. The bone is exposed. I always use a neuronavigation for all my lateral skull base surgeries. A translabyrinthine approach. The labyrinthine block is seen here. The facial nerve is delineated. Translabyrinthine approach is being done. Labyrinthectomy is completed. The whole dura, posterior fossa dura presigmoid is exposed. Tumor resection is initiated. You can see tumor here completely. It was practically a 4 centimeter tumor. Progressive debulking. Finally, you see the facial nerve. Whole tumor is out, and only the facial nerve is seen. Translabyrinthine approach for a vestibular schwannoma. I can not show you too many cases today because of the paucity of time. So what I'll do is I'll quickly go to the last 3 slides of my presentation and show you what the future holds. So what the future holds is this: artificial intelligence and the rise of robots. Now, we all know about the Da Vinci robotic system. The Da Vinci robotic system is a huge system that is supposed to cater to many areas, but it really doesn't work, because in the skull base we have very nuanced surgeries. We have in a very critical area, and the Da Vinci is practically useless, I would say, in an area like the skull base. So what is being developed is what is called individualized robotic systems for human for surgeries. There are robots that are being developed only for the eye, only for the skull base only. So these are smaller robots, more individualized robots, and I've had the pleasure of teaming up with this particular team that is developing these robots, and this is with me with the Indoven Medical Robotics, a Netherlands-based company which is doing pioneering work in developing robots for skull-based surgery, ENT otology. And in the next couple of years, you're going to see big breaking news coming in terms of robots being used for skull-based surgery. Now, apart from robotic surgeries, we are coming up with unique robotic visualization systems. You can see here that Carl Zeiss has developed a beautiful microscope, which is in fact, now I'll just play the video so you can see that it is a beautiful system which integrates robotics with the microscope. So here is a surgeon controlled robotic system which moves beautifully among all axes. It's got rock solid stability, and it gives pinpoint precise movements and lock systems. And along with that, today we have what is being developed, what is called exoscopes. An exoscope is an integration of a endoscope to a microscope. So once the microscopic work is done, you can turn in. See, now along with this, there is digitalization of everything. So everything is now 4K. The images are brilliant, and all this is integrated into one machine. Here you see a micro inspection tool, what we call an endoscope, integrated into the microscope. That's the new exoscope system that is being developed both by Carl Zeiss and by Karl Stoss, and this is going to be the future. And this is what you're going to do in let's say in the next 5 years, if not earlier. So that's about. And now, what about image guidance? Image guidance is already an integral part of lateral skull-based surgery. I do not do any of my surgeries without image guidance nowadays. Okay, so Stryker is one of the pioneers, and then we have Medtronic and many of these people who've devised some brilliant tools. Again, it's all integrated with several of your operating systems. And some of the features are extremely advanced. You can see that the technology is moving up, I would say moving at the speed of light. So in future, we'll have incorporated augmented reality technologies that provide additional visual clues overlain on certain real-world images. So through interactive holograms anchored to specific points in space. For example, the semicircular canals and the cochlea could be outlined as a vibrant color, with the jugular bulb in blue color and the carotid artery in deep red. So these things, so you can integrate augmented reality, and you can give a 3D augmented reality along with the image guidance, and this is going to be the future. And if one does not embrace the future, I would say that one will surely miss out on his career trajectory. So those who look at only the past and the present are certain to miss the future, said John F. Kennedy. But what's more important is what Mahatma Gandhi said: the future depends on what you do today. So the future is not in the tools, not in everything, but what you plan to do for your future. Okay, so with this, I again invite you to Bangalore for the World Skull-Based Fellowship Diplomas. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for being such a great audience. And it's always a pleasure to be with my Egyptian friends. And I hope I'll be visiting you guys soon with the Corona pandemic hopefully getting over soon. So thank you once again for giving me this platform and this opportunity. I wish you all a very good evening. Thank you. Bye-bye.